From one of Australia's former leading homicide detectives, this is I Catch Killers with Gary Jubelin.
One time I was here in Sydney and I was buying multiple ounces of heroin, and I had to go into a block of units, and everyone can hear bug devices, so they could hear the conversation. He used to go and do quarter-ounce deals of heroin all the time. Anyway, we're at the table and he started putting his hands in his mouth, pulling stuff, and I was just going, "What are you doing? Why are you doing that for?"
Yeah.
And everyone got a bit worried about what he was doing, and I think they were waiting for him to say, "Mate, you don't need a gun," and I think the doors would have been smashed down, but they were really worried. But all it was he had these quarter-ounce balloons in his mouth. If he got pulled up, he'd swallow them all.
Yeah.
And it was scary going into a place where no one could see you, what was going on, and you didn't know him. And I had a lot of money on me as well. So, there was obviously outcomes that could have been worse than that.
I Catch Killers with Gary Jubelin.
I first met recently retired Queensland homicide cop, Detective Senior Sergeant Daren Edwards, when our paths crossed on one of the country's biggest murder investigations. That was the hunt for the killers of a man called Terry Falconer, who was murdered, dismembered, and had his body dumped in a river. Today, I caught up with Daren to talk about his impressive career and how he came to my aid when we were pursuing a contract killer across jurisdictional borders. We also spoke about how he arrested Daniel Morcombe's killer, Brett Cowan, and his involvement with Cowan years before he murdered Daniel. Daren, when you were working in the Northern Territory, you arrested Brett Cowan, who later on was found out to be the person responsible for the murder of Daniel Morcombe. You arrested him years before that, and you in fact were involved in the arrest of Cowan for Daniel Morcombe's murder years later. In Northern Territory, what was the offence that he got locked up for there? Can you tell us the circumstances of that?
Yeah, and he had been living at a caravan park, BP Palms, just past Berrima, out towards Palmerston. He'd been living there, and the young boy, he was abducted essentially by Cowan, taken into, because it was all bush around that area. He was sexually assaulted.
How old was the child?
He was around 5, I think, by memory.
Yeah.
But he only had kind of been able to communicate probably more like a 3-year-old. Like he didn't have any specific handicap as such, but he didn't have great communication skills for a boy of that little age.
Yeah.
Anyway, Cowan was living there, as I said. We'd done quite an extensive investigation around every male looking at the caravan, because it was a fairly isolated caravan park opposite an industrial area. And I was one of the more junior detective senior constables there at the time, but we did a door knock of that caravan park. Some interesting characters we came across during that thing. One lady I'd interviewed there gave me a bit of an alibi about Cowan having come there and provided a video to him at this time, and the next day she contacted me and said, "Look, I hadn't told you the quite truth. He told me to tell you that he'd brought this video at this time to try and alibi his movements up around the boy."
For the abduction of the little boy.
Exactly, and the boy had wandered into the caravan park dazed, and he had badly swollen eyes. He had obvious marks around his neck. He was bleeding from his buttock, which was as a result of Cowan having choked him out. And as I said, later on examination, there was sperm on his underpants and things like that. So, but eventually, when the main investigating team, interviewing team, were interviewing Cowan after his solicitor left, Cowan did realise it wasn't looking good for him. He did provide a version, and he wanted to say that he didn't mean, or he wasn't trying to kill the child. When he'd made that admission, then it was the early days of recording interviews and what have you, so I adopted...
Electronic recordings,
So I used a digital recorder and recorded his interview, reiterated what he told the other investigators. So we had the recording, which was later played or presented in the coroner's court for Daniel Morcombe. But it was just that later on where I ended up working, how it comes back to you.
Yeah, well, how long was the offence with the abduction of the young child before Daniel's abduction and murder?
Yeah, it was 8 or 9 years before Daniel went missing at the Sunshine Coast. And when he went missing, I was working in the Homicide Squad in Brisbane then. And then later, in 2011, when he was arrested, I'd got the position as officer in charge of the Sunshine Coast District CIB.
Yeah.
So I was part of that when that unfolded and he was arrested then.
Okay.
So it was uncanny how...
It comes around.
Exactly.
And we'll talk more about the arrest for the Daniel Morcombe murder later on, but that offence that you described with the young child, that's a pretty chilling offence. Like you've been a cop long enough and you know that's an evil offence. How long did he get for that?
He didn't get that long at all. I think he only got about 4 years. Cowan saw a need to say something because he realised that it was evidence of him deliberately choking that boy out. And the only reason you would choke that boy out, it was really to kill him. And then when you throw his body into a rusty old car body, that's not just, you know what I mean?
You're not expecting him to survive that.
Correct.
That's my take on it. You were saying with that investigation, we were talking the other day, and you said that you were doing a small community. You were going around getting DNA from everyone in the community. Yeah,
it was a caravan park. It's isolated, a service station there, BP service station. The caravan park surrounded it. Yeah. So, but it was isolated. There was no other housing around or anything like that. So it was early days of using DNA, but the Northern Territory was quite advanced in those days. And we were even advanced in electronic records of interview. We were already using them. And we saw a need. We thought, well, the initial examined by the scientific officer said there's what they believed was sperm on those underpants. If we get DNA, we would get some evidence against the actual offender. Yeah. So we started to get, and most of the men in the park happily volunteered their DNA for that process. There was a couple of nutcases in there, but eventually we got it. And when I think Cowan saw us doing that, he became concerned.
Knew his time was up. Did you get a sense of how evil Cowan was at that time, and
definitely,
when you dealt with him?
And then we understood when we got his background about him having been involved in an offence on a boy in Brisbane. At a childcare place where he'd been working as a labourer for drainers or something like that. Yeah. And that was that boy had to give evidence. So that was a motive for Cowan to basically shut that child up in the Northern Territory, because he knew there was communication. He'd be able to at least communicate and tell somebody.
Yeah, scumbag, isn't he? Okay, your policing career. Talk us through your policing career. How long were you a cop for?
Yeah, originally I was working in central Queensland before the police. I had some friends in Queensland Police at the time I played football with, and then I got offered a job in the Northern Territory working on mines there. I had a couple of mates I'd grown up with playing football up there. Yeah. The Territory, I owned a house in Brisbane, and you got a free accommodation as part of your employment in the Northern Territory, so it was a money thing as well.
Rent the place out. And
there was rumblings about Fitzgerald inquiry coming in Queensland. Yeah. A few of the mates there saying, don't join here at the moment. So I took the option to join the Northern Territory Police. So I went up there. It was late 85. I think my course was supposed to start before Christmas 85, but I think there were cyclone issues or something like that, and we ended up starting after Christmas. But I went up there anyway, and I stayed with mates, and then I got accommodation. And I finished my training in June 1986. Worked around Darwin, and then as time went on, I saw an interest in criminal investigation work. I think I started in the CIB. I did some relieving in CIB. I liked it, and obviously I got along with them. They're fairly old school detectives, but very good. And I started in the branch in first week of March 1989.
What was working in the Northern Territory like? Because it's such a sparse area too. It's different to policing in the cities.
It definitely was. And look, Northern Territory is a pretty rough place back in the 80s, you know, and pretty hard men, good footballers. So everyone was, into fishing and shooting. And
I describe it as the Wild West.
It was very close. And if you're in the CIB in Darwin, there was only CIB in Darwin, Catherine, Tenant Creek and Alice Springs. So if anything happened out at the Gulf or out in those outlying settlements, we had to go there all the time. So you got to see a lot of the countryside and pretty limited resources as well. And when I started in the branch, and it was common, we actually had a stock squad as well. There was a detective there in a stock squad. It was only a two-man show. You had a Land Cruiser ute covered and used to do trips out to the various stations. There was a lot of stolen cattle, big cattle stations.
So you're catching cattle rustlers.
Well, that was the start of it. But there could be, there might be property stolen from cattle stations and things that you'd go out to it. And it was a lot of, I think, showing the flag, so to speak, with the police and building a relationship with those rural property owners. And I did that. There was Bear Bentham was the guy that I started with there. He was a hard guy, very hard guy, from New South Wales originally. He was mad keen on shooting anything that moved. And so I started off with him and did some trips out to Fitzmaurice and other places in eastern side of Northern Territory, particularly in Borroloola. And so I travelled
areas.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I enjoyed that. I really enjoyed that. And it's funny, I used to see, I got a good view of seeing a lot of Aboriginal original artwork in out-of-the-way places where tourists would never see and things. And I had developed a appreciation of Aboriginal art, which I still have today. But it was interesting. That was my introduction to CIB, so to speak, with Bear Bentham. And then, just went in the normal areas of like the more serious crime of CIB as I progressed. Yeah. And,
What steered you towards going down the detective path?
I think it was just interesting. Look, I wasn't really friendly with a lot of detectives before that. Certainly some of my friends I knew, their fathers might have been old detectives, or it was just an interest. Yeah. And I probably, I developed a skill of speaking to people as well. And so I just fitted in well with that group. And, they're pretty rough and ready crew, but at the same time, they were really good detectives. The old detective sergeants I worked with and senior sergeants, they were good detectives.
It's changed, but I joined the cops around the same time, and I know the old school detective sergeants, been there, done that, seen that. You could learn a lot from them, couldn't you?
Exactly, and the way they spoke to people and building rapport with crooks and being able to talk to them. And look, at the end of the day, it was you were trying to get a confession out of them. Yeah. And they spoke to them well. It was a very good learning ground for me to listen to them and watch what they did.
It's a skill that's changed in criminal investigation, because a lot of the briefs were built on the statements you'd get from witnesses and the confessions you'd get from the suspects, because you didn't have the forensic science backing you up invariably.
Exactly. And like years later, as I went on and got a bit more experience became more of a senior investigator, I suppose, I used to see young detectives go up and with their recorder and say, "Oh, do you want to, take part in an interview?" And they go, "No." And that was I said, "That's not the way you do it. Yeah, everyone talks. Yeah, everyone talks. And when they know that there's some hurdle they've got ahead of me, then they might want to address that and give their version. Yeah, and that used to really annoy me. So that was I think that's a habit. I think." Looking at younger guys when I was at Homicide in Queensland later, I think it started to come back around. They realised you've got to put some effort into it and put some effort in and time into this person. You mightn't like him, or you mightn't like what he's done, but he's got a story to tell.
Yeah, I saw that. There was a period of time where detectives would go, they're not going to talk, and it was almost it was drummed into them like this person's not going to talk. But as you identified, invariably when you sit down, have a chat with someone and spend a bit of time, get to know them, information does come flowing.
And even if they had the solicitors come out and tell them they're not saying anything, blah, 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 they go out, be on remand out the jail. I used to make an effort to go and see them once or twice. Yeah. And sometimes they used to say, "You're the only person that's even come here to talk to me." And if that's as much as you got, you build a bit of rapport that way. It's strange how things later work in your favour or the victim's favour. Because you bother to put some effort into it.
The art of communication, it's such an important thing in detective work. Okay, how long were you... Well, just before we move past the Northern Territory, because you talked about it being a pretty wild and ready place, I imagine working uniform in Darwin, the early days in the 80s, that would have been some wild times.
It was a Friday night in Darwin. It was a pretty wild place. There was brawling between the different pubs and there was a lot of Aboriginal camps around there, so there was a lot of Aboriginal, stabbings and murders and what have you. You just wouldn't know what to expect. But like sometimes on a Friday night in Kavanagh Street or Mitchell Street, where the pubs were, it was mayhem out in the street. And sometimes you had to fight to save yourself, or especially if you had young female officers with you, you had to protect them. Because there was a lot of grubs. You know.
No, it would have been an interesting time policing than it was in the Wild West days. Your decision to transfer across to Queensland Police, what brought that on? Yeah,
look, I was born and bred in Queensland, always thought about it. Then what happened, the Queensland Police were pretty desperate to try and boost some numbers. So they started, I think it was the initial one in the country, quite honestly. They offered a shortened course for serving police to Cowan. I took opportunity for that. At that time, I'd gone to Tenant Creek because it was a bit of like the old Victorian way. You had to go back to uniform to get and do supervisory work to get promoted and then go back to the branch, that type of thing. There was a couple of guys that got promoted in the branch, years back, but that was changing. I once again had a house in Darwin. I rented out. This thing with Queensland was starting to happen, so I applied for that. I was in Tenant Creek. I got acting sergeant's role there. I think the whole time I went there. In, I think, about August '94.
Describe, because we're sitting in the inner city, Sydney suburb. Describe Tenant Creek.
Tenant Creek was definitely the Wild West. Same thing. There was some basic town camps either side of the main strip. A couple of pubs either side, and town camps. They had different. They were different clans too, and they used to meet in the main street. And we used to call it Zulu Dawn was Thursday and the payday. The mayhem of them fighting each other and the injuries they do to each other, and the police would be stuck in the middle type of thing. But some of the injuries and what they did there was pretty horrifying. Working there and getting called out to a camp, and you're in the middle of the dark, and all of a sudden you're in a Land Cruiser ute and a star picket comes straight through the window in front of your head, and things like that. You tell people they wouldn't expect it.
How, from your experience policing, did you have what you consider good role models in those type of areas of how the police situations like that? Because it's a unique situation, and traditional policing doesn't always work in those type of situations.
No, look, but once you hit it on the head earlier, it was communication. And Aboriginal people, was a big Aboriginal area, and there was quite a few guys married Aboriginal girls. My oldest daughter has Aboriginal heritage, but they were very good Aboriginal. They could, if you treated them well, they spoke to you well, and it's the way it was. And there was pretty old school type of policing, and we always acted morally and tried to do the right thing and protect people. And it was the basics were there, even in the middle of nowhere. But if you behave decently towards people, that was reciprocated.
Well, we might make this the theme of the podcast here about the importance of communication in policing. Like you're a vastly experienced police officer, and I know the success you've had comes from your ability to communicate with people.
Yeah, and as I said, you're building a rapport, but it's not just, and all your witnesses were not always above average people either. You had difficult times, your witnesses over the year, and you had to put as much work into them to get them on side as well. And in Northern Territory, a lot of those places still spoke a lot of Aboriginal dialect. English was not their first language, and that used to be, we used to have to get it interpreted and to interview some of them young people. So that was interesting.
No, well, you've got a good broad experience in policing. Then relatively early in your career in Queensland Police, you went to the National Crime Authority?
Yeah, when I came across, initially I finished my short course training in 95. I actually went to Mackay initially first for a while. I got back in the CIB there. Yeah. Recognised, obviously, the detective's designation. Went back in the CIB there. I worked with some really good guys there. Dennis Hansen was the senior sergeant there, a very old school guy. Yeah. Very good group to work with, a good town to work in. And then they were looking for, I'd done some background training when I was in Darwin, like covert surveillance type of training just as initially. And then they were looking for coverts for the National Crime Authority to do some undercover work. And because I was from the Northern Territory, I was in Mackay, no one knew me, essentially. So that's how that started. So I went there in start of 1998.
Yep.
I went there and I did that undercover role for 2 years until 2000. So
okay, tell everyone that's worked undercover has interesting stories. Tell us some stories from your undercover work.
Most of my targets were Sydney targets.
Yeah.
And obviously NCA looked at bigger type of targets. Had, you know, in a way better word, you bought your briefs. You know, there was some targets in Queensland, but they were getting all their gear. Were mostly heroin I was working on then, and cocaine was starting to come in, but a lot of it was still heroin was the main thing. I did do some undercover work on some guys, you know, with hashish. That guy come from a guy from Linsmore who was coming in boats. So I had some variety of characters, but one of them I did down here. I used to come down here quite a bit and do my role there. Certainly had some interesting characters, but I was buying multiple ounces of heroin.
You were playing the drug dealer.
Correct.
In your undercover role.
Yeah. And that was interesting.
Any hairy moments? Because
definitely hairy moments.
Tell us about some.
One time I was here in Sydney, and the guy I was working on here, he was a Lebanese type of guy. He'd come from New Zealand though, but he was here, and I was buying multiple ounces of heroin, and I had to go into this like a block of units, big block of units with a security gate and things like that. So I'm in his unit, and everyone can hear. They had bug devices, so they could hear the conversation. And everyone knew he had guns or whatever, or pistols, and he used to go and do, you know, ounce or quarter ounce deals of heroin all the time. Anyway, we're at the table, and he started putting his hands in his mouth, pulling stuff, and I was just going, "What are you doing? Why are you doing that? What are you doing that for?"
Yeah.
And everyone got a bit worried about what he was doing, and I think they were waiting for him to say, "Mate, you don't need a gun," and I think the doors would have been smashed down, but they were really worried. But all it was he had these quarter-ounce balloons in his mouth that he used to swallow. If he got pulled up, he'd swallow them all.
Yeah.
But he was just pulling them out of his mouth. They had secreted all out, and it just looked a bit, that's what it was. But everyone else for them, and I was getting these phone calls.
Yeah.
Are you okay? And all this type of thing, and I'm trying to shut them up. So that was, that was one that was a bit, and it was scary going into the place where no one could see you, what was going on, and you didn't know him. And I had a lot of money on me as well. So there was obviously outcomes that could have been worse than that.
It would have been exciting times. I would imagine, as scary as certain situations were, the adrenaline would be kicking in, and you'd be getting a bit of a taste for that.
Yeah, and I know, like another guy I get heroin off, and he used to come down to Sydney, but he'd get transported back up, and he was in a rural block off at up the back of the Sunshine Coast, and I wasn't living there then, but same thing. The best we could get was a friendly about a kilometre away with binoculars, and I'd sit in there. And I was buying also, he was buying hydroponics. He had containers up near Bundaberg there at Woodgate, and they were growing hydroponics there as well. I was buying heroin off him as well. But he had this guy there that used to be a bodyguard for President Suharto, and he was just a massive bodybuilder there. And that used to be intimidating there with having them circling around behind you, and you knew you had no one with you.
Yeah. Were you getting around in your cool gear, your Miami Vice look?
No, I was definitely, I was in footy shorts and a blue singlet most of the time. That was that guy. When I came to Sydney, it was a bit more casual, and I'd go, might meet him to have a drink somewhere or something. So I'd say, I'll get around, I'll shout. And I remember this boss I had at the NCA at the time in Brisbane, when I was at the bar buying champagne or whatever, he's ringing me up telling, "You don't buy anything, you get them to buy you." And I said, "I'm trying to make an impression here." So, there was some pretty funny times.
Yeah. How long were you there with NCA?
2 years.
Yeah.
2 years. And then I went to state crime. I went to the armed robbery squad at state crime.
What years was that?
2000 to 2003 I was at the armed robbery squad.
So Stickups were still happening?
Yeah. And we had a really good group there. They kind of reformed the armed robbery squad as opposed to what it was years ago. Yeah. And because we had a lot of banks getting done, TABs, and that's what we focused on.
Yeah.
And we had about 86% clear up rate for that squad. And that squad, they weren't conventional in a lot of the ways they did it. There was more senior guys than me there, but I was a detective sergeant then. But we got a lot of crooks from the jail and rollovers and what have you, and we cleared up a lot of armed robberies.
Yeah.
And against some really good crooks who were killing people as well. And look, that went a bit south for that group in a way, and then it was subject of a Triple C investigation.
Well, I was in the Stickups in the 90s down here in New South Wales, and it went the same way. But people are not making excuses for the ones that went off track. But it was a tough gig, wasn't it? When banks were being robbed and innocent people were being shot, and you had to match fire with fire.
Exactly. And look. If we were getting confession, we weren't doing anything wrong.
Yeah.
We were just trying to, might get them out of the jail and let them visit their girlfriend, and they're entitled to have someone to come and talk to them, whatever it might have been. But there's some of the things I criticising that group of. It wasn't really fair considering the clear up we've got and the evidence got held up in court and that type of thing. But later on. One guy got sacked. And he was like a fall guy. It was pretty bad. And then the other guy that was with him with part of that episode, he later on hung himself and things. So there's terrible outcomes associated, which, every copper's got stories about those type of things happening.
And there was a fine time, and we had it in New South Wales where. Yeah, the armed robberies in the pecking order of crooks. They were the sat at the top of the tree. They were the dangerous ones, and taking them on was hard police work. And they'd pick cops that were capable of matching these guys. And then when it blew up, everyone's going, "Oh, how did that happen?" But they virtually created squads of hard men to go after other hard men. And when it ended in tears, everyone sort of steps away and goes. Oh, how did that happen?
Exactly. And look, as I said, it wasn't always conventional or by the book, so to speak, but your evidence, if you had evidence to use against them, like their admissions, it was going to get tested. So you had to be above board the way that was obtained. If you use some advantages to them and getting them out of the jail so they could see someone, so be it.
Yeah.
But we got them out there to get interviewed, and to them it might be a bit of a game, but they were looking the best deal and the best outcome. Right? And what we're looking for, so the victims, the ladies that are the subject of getting shotgun shoved in their face, they convicted that guy that did that, and that makes them feel a bit better. Yeah. It does. It mightn't be the perfect outcome. A lot of those people in the banks, they never worked again after some of those terrifying things.
And I've had sitting here a lot of ex-armed robbers, not the cop armed robbers, the bad guys, the ones holding up the banks, and I don't think a lot of them really appreciate the trauma that was carrying on. Like there were some of the stick-up guys that I've spoken to that have done the armed robberies thought they were doing good things because they weren't shooting anyone, but the trauma associated with having a loaded firearm pointed at you, as you would know and I know, is it's quite it leaves a lasting impact on you.
Of course it does. And those guys, that's the last thing they're thinking of. They're just thinking, they go in there, scare, get the money and go. And 99% of the time, no intention of pulling a trigger or anything. It was just the fear factor. They wanted to get that money and get out.
Yeah.
And a lot of the staff would just comply and they would remain pretty calm sometimes. So, whilst the methodologies might have been unconventional, the outcome was really for the victims.
Yeah.
And we reduced those banks and TAB robberies virtually to nothing.
Yeah. No, that was a victory for law enforcement, wasn't it?
Exactly
and
right.
it wasn't just what the cops were doing, but the way the banks were making it harder to rob with the security screens and everything else in place.
Exactly. As things changed, security got better, but they used to try other things. I know there was another couple of armed robbers who were convicted. Well, one's dead now. Bell, and the other one, Rowe, was convicted of robbery where they pretended I'll give you an example, they pretended to be Telstra workers outside this Westpac bank, right?
Yeah.
And when one of the tellers or one of the workers came into the foyer, they went in with their pistols and accosted that worker who then had to open the door so they could get behind the tills.
Yeah.
So that's the way they got around that. And that was one Well, we end up convicted, right, because he was a teller and he got the pistol and he managed to, the teller got a fright and hit the gun, which hit the crook in the chin, and he dripped blood on the teller's shirt. We got his DNA.
Right.
And then the other one, Bell, who got shot dead, he went to do another job. I think it was a post office in Brisbane, and the coppers shot him dead during that thing. And then they were mad on disguises. They used to have hair. When he did a place over, he used to steal other people's identities, and then he'd make up moustaches and beards and all types of things. But we got him convicted, and that was a good result and an outcome. That's just an example of what those people went through, and the tellers had to give evidence and everything, so it was pretty traumatic.
And you go to a bank, you're not expecting, you're not going there expecting a confrontation like that, it's a bank of all places. We had one offender get caught. I think he might have died from it. Got caught in a security screen. Went to jump the.
I remember it.
Jump the counter, and the screen's gone up, and
he choked.
Choked to death in there. So.
Yeah, because I remember speaking to the other guy that was in the bank doing that. I remember that. That's interesting.
Okay. Well, you should have retired to a desk job after all this. You've had the action in the Northern Territory. You've been doing the undercover work and then in the Stickups, but you found your way to Homicide.
Yeah, and look, as a detective, Homicide, as you would know, is the epitome of where you want to go if you want to be a detective. To get to Homicide Squad's a pretty great achievement, and that's where that's the worst crime, isn't it? Murder.
Yeah.
And so I went there in 2003 and stayed there until I went to the Sunshine Coast basically in 2011.
Yeah. And what was it about Homicide that attracted you to Homicide?
I think just working on murders are interesting. It was an interesting investigation. You've done that many investigations. And I'd been involved in a lot of murder investigations in the Territory.
Yeah.
And we weren't a big enough squad up there to have a homicide squad. You had to do everything.
Yeah.
We had no child offenders team. We had to do everything.
Yeah.
And I always enjoyed working on homicides.
Yeah.
It was an interesting investigation, learned a lot. So when I had that opportunity to go to Queensland Homicide, jumped at it and had a good time there. And as time went on, we did some good. I used to go to obviously the fresh jobs like I used to, but I also had an interest in some of the cold case stuff because sometimes, as you know, sometimes some information will all of a sudden flow in about something that happened 10 years ago. Yeah. And you could run with it perhaps. And eventually we did form a Cold Coast team, which same as New South Wales and other locations have, which you focus more on it. And you can do a lot of success with it when there's a bit of effort and a team to put into it.
Yeah. And you see the pain that the victims' families carry with these unsolved murders, and as you know, you don't get closure regardless of whether someone's been charged, but it adds to the pain when their loved one's been murdered and no one's been called into account.
Yeah, I don't agree with. I don't think there's ever closure, and there's. People say, I got finalised. They never get finalised because they're going to keep remembering about their loved one who's been tragically murdered and or whatever's happened to them. But it's the outcome result they have. Yeah. Having that means so much to them. That's what it's a lot about.
Right. I read an article that there was quite a few articles around your retirement, and you're talking about homicide investigations. Some of the things that you said. A lot of killings were unplanned and killers made mistakes or were careless, which created opportunities for skilled investigators to bring them down. A lot of them are not premeditated. I pulled those out because that's my reflection on homicide too, how sometimes it's just, you wouldn't believe, sometimes you're looking for this complicated motive for a homicide, but sometimes it's just a situation that escalated. Is that what you're referring to here?
Exactly, and I think like a lot of the murders we see now, a lot of them are planned. Hits and what have you. But a lot of them back then was, especially in the Territory, they're full of grog and the fight starts and all of a sudden there's knife going around, whatever. And there was guns everywhere in the Northern Territory. So there was a lot. They'll just pull out, have an argument, just pull out a gun and just blow them away. So there's a lot of, and then they do their best to try and cover it up. But even some basic murders that might happen that might have been planned, or even if they come planned, they don't think about Mrs. Brown down in the corner, who no one thinks about. Mrs. Brown says, I've never seen that car before. It's a blue car because my son used to have one and drove it. They forget those things, There's a lot of simple things that can be done, especially, they might have gloves on and all this type of stuff. They make mistakes. They rip gloves. They do.
Quite often when you go to a homicide scene, you see the panic not just from, you're reading the scene, you see the panic not just from the victim but also the offender and the type of mistakes they make and their actions afterwards. That, and there are killers out there that can be cold and callous, and we'll talk about a few of them later on. But there's others that, regardless of who or what they think they are, if they take someone's life, it freaks them out. And then they make some stupid mistakes after that, and that's what we tend to capitalise in homicide investigations.
And one of the things, as you know, they don't know what the victim's going to do. Some victims will fight back. And, as you know, they'll fight back because they know that they've got to. It's fight or flight. And then you'll have and crooks talk. Yeah. They talk. They need to talk to someone. They always need to talk to somebody. Yeah. I have dealt with a crook who did everything on his own and didn't tell anyone, but there's a majority of them will talk to somebody, or they've done it with somebody, or someone's in the car, so I didn't know they were going to kill him, but they're driving him backwards and forwards and what have you. Yeah. Or I remember one on the Sunshine Coast where this guy had killed this girl and he went to this guy who was... He was a disqualified driver, but he said, I want you to come and follow me. And he didn't know what it was about, but then learnt this guy had put this girl in the boot and torched this car with the girl in the boot and had to drive him back. That guy used to bump into him at a surf club later on. He said, oh, g'day, Mr. Edwards. But we end up keeping him out of jail, that guy, because he was a disqualified driver and he would have hit the bin for that driving disqualified. But he said, I'm in fear of that guy. I didn't know he had a body in the boot. But I wouldn't have, I thought, it's the public, what is the public interest here to put him in the bin for his disqualified driving? And you've got to accept he would probably not have done that if this guy hadn't have come with him in desperation. Yeah. So you talk about, there's one aspect they're planning they don't do, and then they involve someone else, and there is opportunity there.
Well, I always thought I'm in with a chance if there was more than one person involved in the murder. And as you said, you've come across one that doesn't talk. They're the harder ones to solve. Can I talk about a specific case that I think it was 1999, the murder of 16-year-old student Jessica Gouty?
Gouty, yeah.
What was the circumstances there?
Yeah, I mentioned him earlier, Derek Sam. He was convicted of her murder. She was babysitting. Basically, Derek was with a girl and had a couple of little young children then. Jessica was babysitting them. The woman had gone out. Sam knew she was there, 16-year-old at the time. He'd gone there and coaxed her into leaving the kids, took her. She was never been seen again. Right. And he was convicted of her murder. Her body's never been found. Now, as they looked at that, there was also, this was in 99, but late 98, in 98 there was also Selena Bridge, was an English backpacker, who was walking past when I spoke to you earlier off air. I'd got New South Wales to get a statement off a guy. There was an Aboriginal youth type of property that was leased to take troublesome youths there to try and get them into cattle and horses and that type of thing. Derek Sam was a very good horseman, cattle properties from up in North Queensland. Yep. He was there. This backpacker had spoken to a lady on the road. She was going to a bird watching camp. It was at Kenilworth. Balloomba Creek is a national park out in the middle of nowhere, cattle properties and whatever, but 35,000 acres, I think, of national park and old mining shafts and camping grounds. So there was a bird watching type of convention going on this English backpacker was going to. And those young guys saw that English backpacker walking along the road, and all they remember is Derek going out in his vehicle and gone. She never gets to the park, never seen again. Right. Then later in 99, there's also Ann Glassop, Sabrina Ann Glassop, was living up on a corner house on Balloomba Creek Road. She worked at the school, local school, Kenilworth. Same thing, she just disappeared. And Derek had gone there a number of times with horses and all types of stuff with her. There was a ranger station officer, creek ground near there. 4-wheel drive lights come on. Derek was driving a Land Cruiser station wagon, I think it was at the time. You know, there was so many coincidences that all had Derek linked to it. We got Derek Sam out of the jail, took him to this area.
This is after he's been convicted of the
I got
other crime?
When I positioned up the coast, I wanted to pursue that with him. We got him out of jail, took him there. He was standing on the road, and the guy said he was standing there crying. So, and Jessica Gouty's remains have been found. They initiated in Queensland, no body, no parole.
Yeah.
That was served on him by the Homicide Squad, that letter.
Yep.
But there was always a fear factor that the other bodies were in around the same spot as where Jessica Gouty's body was. So they thought that might be the stumbling block. I actually wrote to Derek Sam to try and talk some sense into him. You'd be quite aware of the Leverson case in New South Wales.
Yeah, I'll just put that in context. That was Matthew Leverson, that the investigation I was involved in, that we worked out a situation where the person that was responsible for disposing of his body gave evidence at an inquest, perjured himself, and then through negotiations we recovered the body. Section 61 certificate. That's what you're talking about here. Trying something along those lines.
And I just come from homicide, involved with a lot of solving some cold cases. There's always difficulties associated with them, and prison transfers, all types of things. But why not try every option?
Yeah.
I followed that case quite closely, and I thought, why couldn't we go to Sam and say, how about we're not going to perhaps charge you anything, because you're already doing life anyway, and that would affect your parole, and you need to recover Jessica's body. If we gave you some type of immunity about whether we charge you with the other two, just so we can recover the remains. Obviously, Slender Bridge was England. I'd spoken to her father, Lionel, quite often. Her mum had passed away over that period of time. I've spoken to Lionel a few times. Lionel wasn't that keen on it. Like he said, I'd rather not see him get out. And I said, well, I think it would affect his parole anyway. But I said, he doesn't get guaranteed parole with that life imprisonment. And I said, it's an opportunity and we could find Selena. But he'd come around to that way of thinking. I said, it's an opportunity to do something, and why not give it a try? People are strange. The Crown was a bit balking at it a little bit when I did speak to one of the bosses there at the Crown. I said, what about this scenario? They used it in New South Wales. Yeah. And it used to annoy me a bit that our laws around Australia or the precedents and what have you weren't more consistent than why the states differed. And I thought it was an opportunity, and there would have been opportunity for others as well, I would say. Daren, with the Matthew Leverson matter, I'm very satisfied what we did was the right thing. Exactly, and I remember seeing his parents' interview later on about it and what it achieved for them. Yeah. So that was really the motivation of it, was about what the outcome you're going to get, the best we're going to get for this family, Look, we got to a stage with Sam. I thought there was enough similar fact evidence to charge him because of the Gouty and similarities. And we did. There was the head of DPP. He is very supportive, quite honestly. Some of the detectives there in the office, one of the guys that was signing the case, he wasn't that keen on that scenario as a similar case. I said, well, what have we got to lose? And he said, well, I hate him to get found not guilty and we don't go again. Yeah. And I said, we've got no body of parole, we've got this other opportunity, and it's about keeping the pressure up on this guy. Yeah. And I wrote to him as well, things like that. So you've got to try alternatives, as you say, otherwise you're not going to get an outcome for the family, and they're getting old. Yeah, well, I won't go into detail with it, but that's something I was working towards with the William Tyrrell investigation. When I was taken off the investigation, that very thing of let's get answers for the family, but good on you pushing it, and we've got to have people and talking about it like this. You get that resistance because people have a clear picture of what justice should be. Justice needs whoever's responsible life in prison. But when the body's not, they haven't recovered the body, don't know what's happened, you've got to look outside the square. Yeah, and like families, I remember like a case, if you don't mind me bringing it up, when I was a homicide, and I had this, and as I'd spoken to you before, I kept having this link to the Northern Territory. It was like the Northern Territory was following me everywhere I was going. You can't take the Northern Territory out of the boy. One day, one of the bosses comes and says to me, and says, oh, you know about this murder over in West End in 96. a woman named June Quinton been found body there, had been there for a few days, and this whole lot there was an old Paul's factory over there at West End. It wasn't very developed back then. Anyway, I said, yeah, I'm aware of that one. He said, there's a guy from the Territory, the Northern Territory Corrections Intel, saying this guy's he's been in the Territory, locked up, he's got a big sentence. He's a Queensland Aboriginal guy, he doesn't want to be there. Do you want to? He said, I don't think there's anything in it, he's just trying to use the system. And I thought, oh, well. So I got on to this Intel guy, and then I got on to found June Quinton's daughter. She said, I always, I said, we're going to try and do some things, but I might need to contact you. I'll try and find the old statements, but I might need to get another statement, whatever. Because the mum was living a semi-homeless type of lifestyle. There was a St. Vincent's de Paul near there at South Brisbane. They used to go and stay there at night. And this, as it turned out, Eric Murray, who was convicted of that murder, and June had in contact with each other in that thing where she'd been a bit rude to Eric in front of somebody. And Eric was a loner, didn't talk to anybody. And old school Aboriginal guy, he'd been convicted of another murder in Bathurst, New South Wales, same thing, attacking women. He had a pretty horrid upbringing at boys' home when he was young, so he was on a path to nowhere, unfortunately, and this is where he ended up. But I got on the Intel there in Northern Territory. He was actually quite a good drawer, an artist in some ways. He'd draw it with colour pencils, a map of the river around West End, because the river ran around West End, drew bridges. It was all coloured where this was happened. And then I said, I actually made some questions. I said, ask him what he actually did to her, because and only the offender knew or someone told him exactly. She had two depressions in her skull, which obviously not that obvious. And he said, oh, I killed her because I hit her over the head with. I had this little bit of steel I found in one of the old buildings there, and I hit her twice over the head with that. That's pretty specific. And exactly where her body was found near this old panel beating shop was there. It was to scales. I actually got a geographical satellite map and his drawing and interfaced them. They were nearly perfect. And this guy's in middle of Alice Springs in jail. He didn't have access to a lot of stuff. So that was pretty good. Anyway, he ended up extraditing back from there. I did an interview with him at Alice Springs Police Station. He came into that, confessed to that. When he came back, he got some influence from the legal fraternity, then wanted to go to trial. The first trial was hung, or something happened there and it was aborted, that's right. Another trial followed. He was then saying, someone told me about it and all this, and it just wasn't gelling. And there was about, the barrister and I sat down, and I found about 11 points where only the offender would had no those specifics. Some other grub telling him in jail this, and they can't, not the specifics of where the body is and drawing maps and all this. And anyway, the barrister had 14 points. Anyway, he got convicted. And I remember June Quinton's daughter sat in that hearing every day of that trial. Every day she was there. And she was that nervous, and when we got convicted. And it was funny, a couple of the jurors up the back, when they come back with a guilty verdict, the judge said to him, look, I know you can leave, but I'd like you to hear his history, because he'd had this sexual attack, and he sexually assaulted a girl in Darwin, he sexually assaulted a girl and woman in murder in Bathurst, things like that. Anyway, remember these two guys high-fiving in the back? I think it was just they knew they'd got it right, if that makes sense.
And that's juries are often mortified when they allow someone to get off a crime and then they find out about the history of the person.
And they say, why didn't we know about this in the first place? And that's, I know that's life.
It's life. It's funny, but I always say we have the juries there, we're our peers to judge us, but they're not smart enough to take into account all the information, which I think there can be or need for some improvements in the way evidence is presented at court. Let's jump forward a bit. There's more cases I want to speak to you about, but correct me if I'm wrong. I think the first time I met you, it might have been at a bar. You were down in Sydney. You were with Howard Hickey, And my memory of the night is that we had a few drinks. We ended up in Chinatown. That's about the last I can remember of that night.
Isn't that, weren't we just revisiting the scenes or something for one of the investigations?
I don't know what caused us to drink. I don't know who had a gun to our head, but I remember the next day I was pretty poor, to say. But our work crossed paths when I was working on the Terry Falconer case. And this is my memory of it. It's going back a while, but you guys were looking at the murder of Michael Davies, who, if I understand, was shot in his home on the Gold Coast, bullet to the back of the head, I think it was. The offender or offenders have run away, jumped the fence, set a van on light, and discarded the gun and the gloves that they were wearing at the time of the murder. You had DNA from that crime scene. We were looking at one of the murders that were caught up in the Terry Falconer investigation, or attempted murders, was the shooting of Rhaenyra Pukatapu, who was at JB's Bar and Grill in Chinatown when a person's come up standing outside the window and shot him 5 times. He didn't die, but his life was affected ever after, and the intended victim in that shooting was Felix Lyle, the president of the Hells Angels, who happened to have a ponytail at the time, and unfortunately Rhaenyra Pukatapu also had a ponytail. The offender from that crime ran right through Chinatown, waving a gun saying, "Get down, police, police," ran all the way through Chinatown, came to a van, threw the gun and the gloves into a van, set that van alight in the city, and we recovered from that scene gloves with some DNA in the gloves. We didn't know who the DNA belonged to. You didn't know who the DNA belonged to, but during the matches were done that it's the same DNA. So that's where we became involved. Is that
that was how we first met, and we had that connection there to those crime scenes and what was next. And then it was obviously your team that got some really good information that gave it direction after that. And obviously we kind of shadowed you guys, I suppose, for a fair bit. So I think our drinking was just, so I'll show you where this happened, I'll show you where that is.
Right, so we were actually working that night. Okay, I thought we just got on the piss, but clearly we had purpose to it. But that was a fascinating job, and I remember the excitement. There was informants involved. It was organised crime, and this crew, these people were out of control. We got DNA from a person we only knew as Redman at the time. That was the information we've got. He had a nickname Redman, and he had a bad reputation as a contract killer. We found out that was Sean Waygood. We got his DNA, a sneaky way of getting his DNA. We managed to get that. And I remember us conferring, and we were very excited that we finally found the person responsible for, or linked to those 2 jobs. But people might say, okay, burnout car, murder, attempt murder, you got DNA on the gloves, surely that's enough to charge the person. We've been around long enough to know that's not enough to get a conviction for murder and attempt murder. So then we were doing a lot of surveillance. You guys were coming down, we're keeping tabs on what Waygood was up to. And this, I've got to thank you for this, because this was one of my most difficult moments in policing. We got a tip-off that Waygood was going to do a hit, and we had our tactical police down in Sydney. He lived at Newcastle at the time, and I was working with Glenn Brown, and we're sitting waiting for him to leave Newcastle, come down the city, and we're going to take him out if he was going to do a hit or murder someone. Unfortunately, instead of turning left, he turned right and started heading north. So Glenn and I jumped in a car, and we had surveillance police following him, and we're on this mad trek on a Friday night heading up the coast. And they kept calling into McDonald's restaurants, which was strange. But that was to use their Wi-Fi in the McDonald's restaurants, because they weren't using phones. He hooked up with a bloke that we later found out had an association with the Russian mafia, and the observations from the surveillance team was he tucked something down the front. They got things out of the boot, tucked it down the front of his pants, which most likely was a gun. We couldn't arrest him because we didn't have enough, and we'd been tracking him for a long time. And then we're starting to get out of New South Wales jurisdiction. This is getting near midnight on a Friday night. And I look up directory assistance to get a phone number for Queensland Police. And Daren, you'd appreciate this. Trying to explain, look, I'm a cop from New South Wales. We're following a contract killer. We think he's going to cross the border, but we can't arrest him at this stage. We just want to see what he's going to do. And you can imagine the reaction I got when I phoned police. And man, I was blessed. You got on the end of the phone. They called you out for that job.
Yeah, and as I said, we tracked him through there and managed to get some surveillance assistants who jumped on it straight away and were very interested. And it was really just a tracking to see what they were going to do or who they took up with, which probably was more interesting at the end of the day for that investigation.
Well, I think it was only you or Howard that I could have spoken to in Queensland Police would have, because your bosses were saying, stuff that, arrest him. My bosses, for the first time, didn't give me directions. They said it's your call if you want to let him run and we think he's going to kill someone. And I remember that we were awake for a couple of days and he was going all over the place, going to hotels. He even went to the casino, and I think you guys tipped the room over. They only stayed there for an hour, hired a room there, and there was some bodgy mobile phone
packets
there. And then that, at the end of 48 hours or even longer of fun, he met up with Anthony Parrish, and that's the first time we got them connected.
And really, that connection to Parrish was then the connection to Davies. And that's how it started to unfold. Yeah. So it showed you how holding off could develop that we started to develop the reasons for both murders. Really.
Yeah. And you got an induced statement. I'm not sure if we can we mention the name. Perhaps we won't mention the name, but you got an induced statement. Waygood's told us about it. Waygood's passed away, so we can talk freely there. He passed away in prison. But you got an induced statement from a person that was with Waygood when they murdered Michael Davies, and it was quite chilling how that played out.
It's a very forthcoming statement, obviously implicating Waygood and the guy who provided the statement, implicated himself. Yeah. He wasn't going anywhere. And I think a lot of that was to paint a better picture of himself, that he wasn't the main hit man, he's the go along with it. Certainly he's complicit in it, no doubt about it, but I think it just confirmed what we thought about Waygood and the other connections.
Well, it was, if I remember rightly, it was quite chilling because we're trying to get a sense of what we're dealing with Waygood while we've got him under the microscope. And in this statement, the statement that you and Howard got from the co-offender in the matter, said that they'd gone through the back door. Michael Davies was eating his breakfast at the kitchen bench, and Waygood's walked up and put a bullet in the back of his head and turned to the other bloke and said, "Confirm kill." And then they ran off, burnt the car, and then went and had breakfast.
Yeah, it was just like a nothing for them.
Yeah.
But if you look, as we know from their history of what they were involved with, it was just work, business for them. And they had no feelings whatsoever. And as you say, Davies was just found slumped on his stool with his head and everything on top of the kitchen bench. Yeah. And shot in the back of the head, and that was it.
It was brutal. That when we were looking at them, they also killed Paul Elliott. Yeah. Which was a Melbourne drug dealer that he flew up from Melbourne to meet with this Asian crime group, and he said to his girlfriend when they booked into a motel, "If I'm not back in 20 minutes, I'm dead." And he was dead, and they dumped him in the out in the ocean in a toolbox, which seems to be the Sydney way of getting rid of bodies. Take them out the harbour. But they were just chilling when you're going after people like that, because I remember we got statements from the person involved in that murder, and when they were about to throw the body in the water, someone said, "Do you want to say any words?" Like a funeral, and I think one of them said, "No, stuff it," and spat on the box and kicked it in the water.
I mean, like Davies, that was the middle of the day, in the morning, just broad daylight. That's a pretty they didn't really think about it, and they weren't scared about anybody else. I mean, if there's someone else interrupted them, they would have died as well. Simple as that.
Well, it was an interesting case, and I enjoyed working with you and Howard on it. And again, I thank you, because I did not know how I was going to explain why we're letting a contract killer run across borders that we think's armed, and probably on his way to kill someone.
And look, at that time we knew that Waygood would have been right for Davies, and we, as you said, we didn't have enough, and there was too many other players involved we hadn't identified. And certainly the hierarchy were accepted our impression that we shouldn't interrupt them, we shouldn't do anything, because it would make it a lot worse. And I think it was just some sense, hold off and have that patience, and you will get a result, as it turned out, in New South Wales. And Waygood died, but at least we knew who the players were who were convicted. Anyway, there's an outcome. Like Davies had family and wanted to know what had gone on. At least they knew. And when we talked about, they talked about the series later on, when the family realised what connection he had to that. They're surprising that more didn't happen, or other family members were involved.
Yeah, well, we I think we locked up 14 people all up between us on that case, and they were convicted of some murders and all sorts of things. So it was an interesting case, but it was challenging for a lot of reasons. But it's good when you get to work with someone from a different jurisdiction and you talk the same language.
Well, I think I said to you, over a period of time, you meet somebody, at least you had confidence and you were comfortable. I could contact you about anything, even if it was a different matter, or just get some advice. And certainly, as I said earlier, I'd spoken to Brown and got him to do some inquiries for another, the Derek Sam matter, for instance, and things like that. So it's easy to pick up a phone and try and get something done. And when you've got those connections and you think the same. And you enjoy each other's company, to be honest. You have a beer and you talk about the same business without any problems, and be honest with each other, and you develop some pretty good relationships. I certainly have, and you have too, over that many years. And I still come down there to Randwick and go to the races, meet up with a lot of New South Wales, Victorian guys, and they're lifelong friends, really.
It makes a difference, doesn't it? And you have that bond for forever. We might take a break here, and there's as our listeners would attest to, there's plenty more to talk about. We're going to go full circle and talk about your involvement in the rest of Brett Cowan for Daniel Morcombe. A whole range of other things, and I'm going to put you on the spot about something, and I can see the smirk on your face. You probably know what that's about, but you deserve this.
Okay.